Always trust.
We ask the questions.
What is needed in the world?
Francuska je jedna od evropskih zemalja sa najvećim procentom muslimana, ali nakon napada u Parizu prošle godine, na njih se gleda sa dozom sumnje. Optuženi da ugrožavaju sekularni poredak Republike i da su prijetnja sigurnosti, suočavaju se sa svakodnevnom diskriminacijom. O položaju muslimana u Francuskoj, diskriminaciji, marginalizaciji, za Al Jazeeru govori Yasser Louati.
Now, Mr. Yasser Louati, once again, hello and welcome to Al Jazeera. Now, you're one of the more prominent French Muslim activists and intellectuals. Could you explain to our viewers in the Balkans, now bearing in mind the rising right-wing tendencies and the anti-Muslim bigotry in France and in Europe, is the atmosphere in France now worse than it was in the post-September 11 days?
Yes, definitely, because back after 9/11, the atmosphere was bad, but it was still kind of a challenging initiative by the Islamophobes to have their rhetoric accepted. Now their rhetoric has become mainstream. So whatever the far right has been preaching in the 80s or 90s now is completely normal. You know, we speak about the Le Penization of the minds. It's saying that, you know, the rhetoric used by Jean-Marie Le Pen for the Front National or his daughter Marine Le Pen is now being said by left-wing ministers and even so-called progressive or liberal intellectuals. And the atmosphere, to be honest, is quite toxic in France, and I'm very pessimistic for the upcoming months. I have no intention of hiding the truth, because we have an upcoming presidential election in less than a year, and the elites have no project for the country. They don't. We don't hear about various socio-economic debates. We don't have any new ideas about how to run the country, how to face globalization, how to make France again a force of change. It's only about identity, and by constructing an identity in opposition to minorities. When I say minorities, understand Muslims.
This has been a centuries-long narrative.
The problem with that is that it happened before, but today it has become a central argument. Because back in the 80s, you had this narrative that Muslims may not be French enough or good enough or fit enough to be French, but you still had debates about, you know, socio-economic policies, you know, corruption scandals, etc. Now everything, I mean, like when you hear various ministers telling you that the major topic of the upcoming presidential election is going to be laicite and Islam, you truly have reasons to worry, because the project is not a project for the country. It's a project against Muslims to divert attention from the betrayal of the French elites towards their own country. And this is where the challenge lies. It is for us to bring back the debate to what matters, meaning that the skyrocketing unemployment rate, the corruption in our society, the failed political system, the bankruptcy of our various elites and elite groups and political parties, the fact that people in the next generations will have less opportunities than the previous generation. We also have to keep in mind that about 25% of our youth is unemployed. And to quote to you what Prime Minister Manuel Valls, a notorious Islamophobe in France, admittedly said that yes, there is unemployment, yes, there are socio-economic issues, but what matters is the cultural struggle. And he quoted the Muslim headscarf as being the central piece of this debate.
Why has it come to this? Why are Muslims, especially in France, scapegoats for every major problem that the country faces?
The nation state has always needed to have scapegoats all the time. This is a historic trend that keeps repeating itself over and over again. But what, in the case of France, is that France has not solved its colonial past. It is unable to look at its own citizens from the past colonies as full-fledged citizens. They are still the indigenous people we need to discipline and to civilize. And for example, when you look at in the 70s, when the factory workers and construction workers decided to go on strike, they didn't say, oh, well, now they're French enough to go on strike, which is a French tradition. They said these strikes are holy strikes being commanded by the Iranian mullahs, and which is absolute nonsense, because Muslims in France are most overwhelmingly Sunnis with no connection to Iran. And when you have, for example, with the rise of the second generation in the 80s, marching like in 1983 for equality, dignity, and against police brutality, re-emerged the debate on French identity, saying that we have to repeal the law of the soil and that you become French only by blood. That rhetoric was applied to Jews in the early 20th century. So you see this trend coming again and again, but Muslims now are again proving that France is incapable of dealing with first a colonial past and dealing adequately with minorities. We shouldn't forget that France has for centuries persecuted minorities. Muslims today, Jews yesterday, before that the Spanish. We had internment camps during the Spanish Civil War, the massacre of the Italian workers, and even if you go back to as far back as the French Revolution, the Vendéans in southwestern France were massacred by the revolutionary forces because they were still a minority of believers facing this new secular, this rising secular republic. This is not new, and France until this day is incapable of that, saying, okay, we had a past, we have to deal with it, and we have to solve the legacy of this colonial past and now how we deal with minorities. And to finish, the fact that you hear constantly officials saying that when minorities seek equal treatment, they are asking for privilege. So that tells you that, you know, it's a sense that these minorities cannot be equal to us, and if they want to become equal to us, it becomes unacceptable.
Right. How are French Muslims reacting to these new developments? Are they becoming more isolated, or are they really confronting these new prejudices and fighting against them?
There is no straight answer to that. The answer is multi-facets. There are Muslims who are becoming more and more isolated. They turn back to their religion and find a sense of comfort and security by turning to their religion and living aside from society. That's what the Islamophobes want, so they can prove their point and then justify new measures. They don't want to integrate. Then you have Muslims who are literally fighting for their dignity. So several studies have showed that the persecution of Muslims in France has pushed many students to excel in school, because they know for a fact if they are equal to the average French citizens, they will have 4 times less chances. Quote me on that. It's a recent study by the Institut Montaigne. Then you have the ones who are just lost. They are not part of their heritage, and they are not part of this country. So they are just on the loose. These are the potential victims of both the radical groups like ISIL, Al-Qaeda, etc., and then the Islamophobes who prey on these people to turn them into victims because they don't have a connection with either communities, the national community, or they are Muslim or the Arab community. The encouraging sign is that more and more Muslims are speaking up and, you know, smashing the doors, saying that you won't accept me, you won't let me be, then I will either get my own business or oblige you to accept me as I am. And this is why you see more and more media outlets being set up by Muslims, more and more communication campaigns launched by Muslims to build a counter-discourse to the dominant group rhetoric. It is still at the early stages because there is no political maturity to that, but the trend now is, you know what, you won't accept me as I am, I will make you accept me as I am. My fear is that both sides become polarized and confrontation will become more and more bitter, because on the other side, when you have politicians, media, and so-called public intellectuals constantly problematizing whatever initiative is made by Muslims, you are basically telling people we are heading towards a civil war. And we know historically that, you know, the racist fringe of French society has always fantasized on purifying the country through civil war.
Right. Following the latest attacks in Paris, we heard from many different media outlets expecting Muslims to distance themselves from these attackers, to condemn these attacks, and to take responsibility for these attacks.
Because Muslims are not like us. In the collective imaginary, They are different, so therefore they are a monolithic group, and therefore they are connected somehow to these groups. But you mentioned Andras Breivik, but just a couple of days ago when Joe Cox was called, it was a political crime, yet if the guy's name was Ahmed or Mahmoud or Abdul Latif or whatever, he would have been called a terrorist. Look at the Orlando shooting and the double standards being applied to that. Nobody held Christians responsible when George W. Bush invaded Iraq, destroyed the country in the name of Jesus, when he said, God gave me a mission to invade Iraq. ISIL is a direct result of George W. Bush's actions. Nobody asks Jews to distance themselves from what Israel is doing to the Palestinians in terms of, you know what, I have no word for whatever is happening over there. And the same thing happened for what happened in this country. Who held Christians responsible for the genocide in Srebrenica? I never heard of it. So this is a permanent, a perpetual double standard that is completely acceptable. And it is right for journalists like yourself and various intellectuals to constantly put the West before its own double standards and contradictions. I think the crisis of the West lies in the fact that there is a huge gap between what is being preached in terms of liberal values, progressive values, etc., and what is being applied. And as long as there is a conflict between these two, then we will continue hearing what you just mentioned and seeing them preaching something abroad while applying the exact opposite at home. I can speak for France, for example. We keep having this foreign policy on human rights. Human rights are not even applied in my own country, in France. A couple of months ago, the French government officially declared that they will withdraw from the European Convention of Human Rights so they could properly tackle terrorism. They officially launched a campaign of targeting practicing Muslims in their mosques and in their homes. Where are the human rights and where are civil liberties?
But this is happening throughout Europe and in the United States as well, with the Patriot Act.
Exactly, the Patriot Act is another example, and this is why Islamophobia is not a problem for Muslims only, it's a problem for Muslims and non-Muslims, because what applies to Muslims today is only a matter of fact before it is applied to others. You mentioned, for example, the Patriot Act. First, it was sold to the general public against the extremist threat. Then it was extended to mainstream Muslims, and then guess what? It was applied to the whole country until the Edward Snowden revelation. Same thing in France when they passed the bill on the state of emergency, giving extraordinary powers to the state, to the police, to the governors. They could arrest anybody, put it under house arrest without accountability or supervision by the justice. Well, what happened? Within 2 weeks, after these measures were applied in complete silence against Muslims, it was applied during the climate summit in Paris, and against who? Environmentalists, human rights activists, union leaders, etc. And I was invited once for a public event to speak about my experience as a Muslim human rights activist, and I had no other word but saying, join the club. You remained silent while watching Muslims getting beaten in their homes and mosques and businesses, and being humiliated. Well, what happened 3 weeks ago to Muslims is happening to you today. And that gave birth to 2 coalitions I am proudly part of to tackle not only the state of emergency, but any security measure being taken by the government, because so far 30 laws have been passed in France against terrorism. None of them brought results. And even we have an official statement by the National Security of Defense in France said that security-based strategies don't work. We need to be proactive by being inclusive and reaching out to various communities. That was sent to the government in 2013, 3 years ago. Yet the government ignored that report and preferred to launch a PR campaign by holding Muslims responsible, and not the state itself that failed not only to protect the population once, but twice in the same year through 2 waves of terrorist attacks. To my knowledge, after nearly 150 people got killed during the January and November attacks, nobody got sacked, nobody got pushed to resignation, nobody took responsibility. Yet Muslims were held responsible for the failures of the French government. And that's why now I keep saying that what affects Muslims today will affect others tomorrow.
But do you see European Union states, with all the new anti-terrorism laws, becoming more like sort of police states like the ones we have in North Africa and the Middle East?
We see first we have to go beyond that and look at the neoliberal agenda being implemented throughout the European Union and North America. The neoliberal agenda comes with structural inequalities, and if you want to maintain these inequalities, you need repression. A strong police state, mass surveillance, because people won't accept these unacceptable levels of inequalities. So this drift towards more security and more state brutality is just the result of the acceptance of this neoliberal agenda made, of course, by number one, austerity measures and the skyrocketing revenues for the wealthier at the expense of the poorest people.
Right. Over the last couple of years, especially after the attacks in the offices of Charlie Hebdo and the latest attacks in Paris, by what percentage have Islamophobic attacks, both verbal and physical, increased in France?
In 2015, Islamophobic attacks increased by 18.5%. But there was a huge increase, I think it was plus 500% in the first semester of 2015, because we were still after during the aftershock of the January attacks. The major shift that happened after November 2015 is that violence came less from ordinary people than from the government itself. Because, for example, there were over 300 cases of state of emergency abuses specifically targeting Muslims. And when you hear...
Meaning police officers abusing their powers.
Yes, exactly. I mean, it comes from the national, the government level, because powers are given to the governors, the prefect, and the prefect, gives agency to the police to conduct searches, raids, etc. But these raids were conducted with complete impunity, brutality, humility against everyday citizens. And after 3,500 raids within a couple of months, only 5 inquiries were opened on terror charges. Meaning that in the meantime, you have deliberately targeted families, humiliated a huge fringe of the French population. We're talking about several million people who are the usual suspects, without tackling terrorism itself. And to my knowledge, the only 2 times the police was able to conduct a raid towards suspect terrorists linked to the November attacks, it was made possible because people called the police.
Muslims?
Yes. Which means collaboration between the people and the state. But as long as you hold a huge, the whole community as a suspect, you can't expect any collaboration on their side. I was dealing with the case of a person who was working with the police, who was also who got raided by the police and was humiliated in front of his wife and kids. By the prefect, he sent the military police, what we call the gendarmerie. When the police heard of this, they went crazy. They said, if this person is targeted and he's our ally within the community, who else is safe? How can we reach out to these people when we target them randomly without any proofs or charges against them, but just to send a message to the broader population, don't worry, we are going to discipline these savages. The end result is that this kind of primitive security approach is only playing into the hands of ISIS, Al-Qaeda, because they need the persecution of Muslims to continue hiring and to also have the arguments to convince others to join them. Look, for example, at the press release after the Bataclan attack. It's two things. They said, we did this for what you're doing in Syria and for what you're doing to Muslims. That means, this is the Western complex of thinking that others are constantly idiots. Daesh is not a bunch of idiots. They know what they're doing and they are pretty good in their communication. The problem is that we haven't had a sophisticated approach to counteract at the intellectual level. How come Daesh is capable of using France's social problems against it, and then to be able to recruit and even to shed blood on its own soil? The question needs to be remained, and that's why I hold responsible François Hollande and Prime Minister Valls, not only for failing to protect us against these terrorists, but to also pursue policies that reinforce the rhetoric of these terrorist groups.
Quite a number of young French Muslims have joined ISIL and other Al-Qaeda affiliated groups in Syria and in Iraq. Apart from being marginalized in their home country and apart from the French foreign military interventionism in the Middle East, what are the other major driving factors that lead young Muslims to join such radical groups?
If you don't belong to a group, you don't belong to a group. You grow up in a country which elite council tells you, you are not one of us. And then they pass laws to target you, your mother, your daughter, your sister, your wife, because by keeping her out of school, out of jobs, by humiliating her constantly on television and making her like this person that needs to be freed. And then you have these groups telling them, well, you come to us, you will fight for your honor. And of course, many of them who go there want to come back because they just go over there and find out it was a complete lie. But what has to be analyzed, and this hasn't been done, how come France, which is home of the biggest Muslim minority in Europe, a country that has the longest historic ties, for the good or for the worse, with the Muslim world, a country that passed the highest number of laws specifically targeting Muslims, and a country that has justified the exclusion or the structural exclusion of Muslim females. How come this country is at the same time the number one or one of the number one exporters of foreign terrorist fighters? A question needs to be asked. You have the biggest Muslim minority, you have the greatest, the most stringent policies targeting this minority, and you have a correlation with the highest number of foreign fighters. You have to ask a question, where have we failed? But again, when you have the Prime Minister of France, Manuel Valls, telling you that explaining is forgiving, that means you're basically saying people are born terrorists. There is no mechanism behind that. It's just like, and I was asking one day through a media, okay, is the Prime Minister going to push for a bill to check the bellies of pregnant Muslim women to make sure their babies won't be terrorists? No. And we have a complex, the process of radicalization is not a straight line process. There are similarities, personal failures, some kind of intellectual, psychological deficiencies, etc. But we have to ask ourselves, how come the French government hasn't been able to back down from all these security measures and look at the complexity of the problem and not adopting a binary approach? And one of the examples how the government is not looking to solve the problem, but just to make more communication on top of communication. We had a project a couple of months ago from the French government that wanted to change the French constitution by implementing a permanent state of emergency and by revoking the citizenship of people who are convicted terrorists. In de facto, that means you're going to have a structural police state protected by the Constitution, and then you're going to have two types of citizenship. Those who can lose their citizenship and those who can't. Because if you are convicted of terrorism, and we know who this speech was aimed at, everybody knew that they were targeting Muslims. Because these measures of revoking citizenship were not brought to the table when the Corsicans were making terrorist attacks, or when the Basques are making terrorist attacks, or when the OAS, which was the organization of the secret army, was even threatened to overthrow Charles de Gaulle because he was giving independence to Algeria. It wasn't applied against Maurice Papon, who was a convicted criminal and judged for the deportation of thousands of Jews. Why now that this violence is carried by brown-skinned people becomes applied? They are double standard, because as long as these terrorists were white, they were still part of us. All right, we will not strip them of their French citizenship. But now that these people are from a different background, the former colonies, well, again, we continue with this rhetoric saying that they are not French enough, therefore we should, ship them out. You don't solve the problem of terrorism by shipping out your own citizens. When a kid is born in France, goes to school in France, commits a crime in France, is judged and goes to jail in France, it's a French problem. You don't send him back to the country of his parents or grandparents, because that would be again fleeing from the problems you have created yourself.
Now let's talk a little bit about the social media and double standards. What I noticed after the attacks in Paris, the social media was literally flooded with Je suis Charlie statuses and French flags on profile pictures and so on and so forth. However, when similar attacks take place in Ankara, Istanbul, Beirut, or Baghdad, we see only a fraction of that.
One day I had an argument on this question, saying that, oh, well, if they are far away from us, we don't feel concerned. Then this begs the question, how come nobody felt concerned every single time Ankara was attacked? But people felt concerned when Orlando was attacked. I'm sorry, Ankara is closer to Paris than Orlando. That's for one thing. The other one is that you don't, we are sick and tired of these symbols. And of course, yes, people can argue about the Eiffel Tower being lit or not, or in the colors for Bamako, it wasn't, or any other city being attacked, or Tunis, etc. But the question is, when are we going to tackle the root causes of terrorism? Because it is good to light to light up the Eiffel Tower to the colors of a country. It is good to make drawings and je suis whatever, Belgium, Paris, etc.
But it doesn't solve the problem.
Yeah, it doesn't. You are just sticking to symbols while people are dying. Well, I'm sorry, you don't fight a global threat with symbols and drawings, and we should hold responsible the policy makers who made the terrorism a global threat. It could be either those who invaded Iraq, those who are participating in the conflict in Syria, those who are arming various faction groups and hiring all over the globe, and of course question our foreign policies based on imperialism. We cannot be the source of the horror stories of foreign peoples and then expect ourselves to be happy. You don't export bombs abroad and expect flowers in return.
Nor do they want to reconsider their foreign policies towards the Middle East or towards Israel.
That's why you have various so-called counter-radicalization programs. As first, it is only targeting Muslims, and when you take part in these workshops and colloquiums, you can't question foreign policies. And that's why I never go there, because I am not going to accept the fact that these Muslims are somehow responsible because they are Muslims. If you want to tackle radicalization, you tackle all kinds of radicalization, that's for one thing, but we cannot separate the rise of international terrorism from foreign policy. If you do that, that's just like lying to yourself and looking for excuses to keep yourself out of accountability.
Mr. Yasser Louati, once again, thank you so much for speaking to Al Jazeera.
Thank you for inviting me.
Yeah.
Thank you. I'm honored.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.